Hello and welcome to day 3 of Ramblings from the Study. Originally they were called Reflections, which sounded much more profound and much more professional, but I think I've decided to call them Ramblings from the Study because that's much more accurate. Having looked at the last 2 videos which I've made, that's what I appear to do, is ramble, go off in tangents and talk about stuff that has no relevance at all to Mark's gospel, which is this thing that I am supposed to be sharing with you. But I promise you, pinky promise, I am going to be looking at Mark's gospel today. But before I do so, this seems to be a pattern that I fall into. Before I do so, I just want to touch on yesterday's video, day 2, or was that day 1? I think it was day 2. If this is day 3, this is yesterday was day 2. Day 2. So I want to touch on yesterday's video, day 2. One of the things I was incredibly conscious of is once I made the video and uploaded it to YouTube, where you would have watched it, I was cut off. Just like that. I mean, how dare they? It wasn't me that cut myself off. Somebody, something, some force, some entity decided to cut me off just as I was about to share some profound answers with you. Hopefully not today. If they do, it's a conspiracy and somebody does not want me to make these videos. However, with your support, and maybe it's because you're bored and you've got nothing else to do, I am going to continue to make these wonderful videos. I'm getting a hoot out of these. These are just, I'm easily entertained. There's no question about that. And because the days are pretty long at the moment, this is the highlight of my day. You know, it takes me about 22 hours to make the video, and you only get about 20 minutes worth. Oh, and that was the other thing I need to say. Yesterday's video went on and on and on and didn't seem to come to an end. Maybe that's why somebody out there decided, cut them off. Just, you know, take the scissors, stop. So what I am going to do is I'm going to keep these videos to a length of 10 minutes. Now that's probably a lie. That 10 minutes will probably creep into 15 minutes. But you have my permission to watch 10 minutes worth and then just stop. Just stop and then go and watch the telly, EastEnders or whatever else is on the TV. So somewhere in this room there is a timer, and if you hear a ping after about 10 or 15 minutes, that is time for me to just stop. And if I hear that ping, I'm just going to stop. I could be in the middle of a sentence. I don't care. I'm just going to stop the recording. That's how it's going to work. And finally, that too is probably a lie because something else will come into my head. But finally, I think the other thing I wanted to mention about yesterday's video, I thought it was going to be so clever because I found this editing program and where there were words that I could add to the video. Now, if you recall from yesterday, if you haven't watched yesterday's video, why not? Don't jump into day 3. You need to go back to day 1 to get an idea of where I am in day 3. But in yesterday's video, at one point I said Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And when I was pointing my finger to the 4 corners of the screen, words would have appeared. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And yet, again, this conspiracy, when I uploaded my video to YouTube, my words disappeared. So I'm going to try again today and mess about with it and see if I can be incredibly clever and cut myself out and put a different face in. And I meant to say, here's another thing. You know what I mean? My hair is a wee bit windswept because I was outside emptying my bin. I got permission, and I was only outside for 2 minutes, and I never met anyone. There's no one out there, just me. So there we go. Oh, and finally, and this really is finally, and again, you would need to have watched video 2 to know what I'm talking about today. on day 3. These are not my pajamas. That's all I need to say. So, welcome to these ramblings, reflections, no, maybe ramblings, all from the study looking at Mark's Gospel. So I have my Bible in front of me, open at Mark, the book of Mark. Let's just call it a book, because that's what it was. That's what I mentioned yesterday. 66 different books that make up the Bible. And Mark's Gospel is one of those books, one of those 66 books. I've already mentioned to you that Mark's Gospel is the earliest Gospel written out of the 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. See if those words appear later. So, Mark is the earliest Gospel, and it was written, let's say Jesus died around about AD 30-ish. Mark's Gospel was written about 30 years later. And that's quite a while. I mean, I don't even remember what I had for my tea last night. So it's really interesting that there is a 30-year gap, approximately a 30-year gap. Sorry, there was a bit of a jiggle there. A 30-year gap before Mark decided to write things down on parchment. But that's what happened. Matthew and Luke, 2 of the other Gospels, they wrote their Gospels some years after Mark. And the final Gospel, John's Gospel, was written many years, probably in AD 90. Some scholars, obviously I'm not one of them, would suggest that it was written about AD 100, 70 years after the death of Jesus. Now here's the interesting thing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar Gospels. It's the same stories appear in each of those 3 Gospels. John is completely different. I'm not even going to touch on John. If this pandemic lasts for 2 years, I'll get round to looking at John, but hopefully it's only going to be a matter of weeks, if not months, before I can stop making these things and get back outside. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar, and the same stories tend to appear in each of these 3 books. Now here is the interesting thing. So when Mark was written, Matthew and Luke, at different times, had Mark's Gospel in front of them. And they copied everything Mark had written. You can't do that now. No, that's a locking up offence. But they copied virtually the whole of Mark, and they put it into their books, and each of them, Matthew and Luke, added extra bits and sometimes tweaked a wee bit of Mark. So theoretically, Mark's book stands on its own, but Mark's book is also found in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. Whoa, did you know that? I didn't. Well, I did actually. Yeah. That's why I'm sharing it with you. So I'm going to be looking at Mark. I've got the book open, and I'm going to be reading. So yesterday I was talking about chapters and verses. So if you've got your Bible, you will know what I'm talking about. So I'm looking at chapter 1, right at the very beginning of this book, and I'm going to read the first 3 verses for today, and we'll see how we'll get on. So yesterday, I think, I'm not very sure if it was cut off before I shared this with you yesterday, or maybe it was after, but today's chapter has a title, and it's the preaching of John the Baptist. Now, again, before I read these first few verses, one of the things about Mark, and I know about this because I'm clever, but humble, but one of the things about Mark that we know of is that he knew this guy, John the Baptist. He knew that John had his own disciples. Jesus had disciples, but so had John. Disciples are just followers, like a fan club. So John had his own disciples, his wee group of people who looked up to him. Mark knew about this. Mark also knew that because he attracted the crowds, the head guy at the time, the guy that was in charge of so many things, is a guy called Herod Antipas. No, I'm not making that name up. That was his name. Herod Antipas, not Antipants. Antipas. A-T. No, that's a lie. A-N-T-I-P-A-S. I'll put it up on the screen. Herod Antipas. Now, John was executed. John the Baptist was executed. Later in the Gospel, we'll get to that bit, but he was executed by Herod Antipas. And Mark knew about that. And the other thing that Mark knew about John the Baptist was that because he was popular with the people, he attracted the displeasure, if you like, of Herod, and therefore the suspicions of the Romans, that the Romans were in charge of the city, kind of a military force. So we know that Mark knew John quite well. And I think that's why he begins with John. So that's just some background. Fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, still with me? Good. Thumbs up. So here's the first few verses. The preaching of John the Baptist. Now, the thing about John, see, let's be off again, away at a tangent. But I think I mentioned this yesterday, but yesterday seems so long ago. John the Baptist was a kind of unique guy. He was a kind of a guru, one of these holy people. We get them all over the place, actually, today. You know, people that we think, crikey, he looks, or she, I'm not being sexist, they look as if they're full of wonder and wisdom and insight. And so John was one of these characters, and he was a bit like a recluse. He kind of disappeared away from the big towns and the cities, and he lived in the desert, eating plants and vegetation and honey from bees. And it's a very simple diet, and he wore clothes that of what was it? A coat of camel's hair and stuff like that. So that would have been okay for living in the desert, but he would have stood out. There's no question about that. John, just call him John. John would have stood out. Moved to the desert, people thought, this guy must have something to say. So crowds would leave towns and villages and go to the desert to listen to what this man had to say. And often he would say things that weren't terribly popular to those that were listening. He didn't say nice things to them. But we're going to get to that bit. Back to our chapter. Chapter 1, the preaching of John the Baptist. Preaching back in those days is teaching. The teaching of John the Baptist, good enough for me. So this is what it says. Chapter 1, verse 1. This is the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, straight away, just that first verse, there's a lot of assumptions that Mark is making. He hasn't talked about John the Baptist. That's just the heading. And if you're following this in your Bible, rather than listening to me, you maybe see it for yourself. The preaching of John the Baptist. Then he goes on, this is the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Wow. Now, if we were reading this book from scratch and we knew nothing about Jesus Christ, Christ is a title, by the way. It's not his surname. Well, my surname is Stevenson. That Christ is a title. Indeed, accurately, it would be Jesus the Christ, not Jesus Christ like a surname. This is good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So when Mark was writing this, people would know about God. But they probably wouldn't have known about Jesus. So anyone coming to this book for the first time, they might have been asking, Jesus, Jesus. But the giveaway is this word Christ. So Christ means Messiah, like God's appointed one. And the people of Mark's day, of John the Baptist's day, first thing, they believed in a deity, which is unusual, completely different. If they were transported in a TARDIS first century Palestine to 21st century United Kingdom. Well, they wouldn't be able to do that because there's no movement because of this virus. But let's just say, for the just sake of argument, they could. One of the things that would astound them would be that the majority of people in the UK didn't or don't believe in God. They started with the premise, we believe in God. The modern world today, I don't believe in God. Not me personally, but so many people would say, I don't believe in God. Give me proof. They didn't need proof. They would find that strange to... why do you need proof for God? I mean, just look around you. Look at the world. Look at creation. Look at stars and all these sort of things. How did they come about? Now that we have this scientific, rational brain, we can question the very things that the other Palestinians took for granted. So the first thing is they believed in God. What they were a bit unsure of was about this guy Jesus. They knew that at some point in their history, God would send a Messiah, a Christ, who would come and save the Jewish people from the tyranny of Herod Antipas, remember him, and the Romans, and they would be free again. So they were always looking for a Messiah to break in to their humdrum lives and say, "Ta-da! I have come to save you." So the first sentence is, this is the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So straight away, Mark is saying, Jesus, the Son of God, is this Messiah that you guys have been waiting for. Verse 1, verse 2. Hopefully you're keeping up. It began as the prophet Isaiah had written. Now, again, I need to kind of take you away from Mark's gospel, especially if you don't know much about the Bible. Isaiah was known as a prophet, and he belongs to the Old Testament. Remember, I was talking about the Old Testament in day 2. Maybe it was even day 1. I can't remember. But he belongs back to the old promises. And a prophet, again, is like these holy people who share insights into what they think will happen if we don't mend our ways. Now, I think that there are many modern prophets, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. I mean, there's just 2 straight away. People who kind of read the signs of the times and said, look, if we don't change our ways, things are going to get worse. And so Isaiah was one of these prophets. He was more or less saying, things are going to get messy if we do not pull our socks up. Interestingly, this quotation from Isaiah, this is when it gets complicated, but please stay with me, isn't really from Isaiah. You need to trust me in that one. It's from a different prophet, a prophet called Malachi. That's the name, Malachi. It comes from him. And so there's a bit of discrepancy about why has Mark said, this is the prophet Isaiah writing. It wasn't. It was Malachi that was writing. I'll try and explain that later. That's level 2. This is just level 1. If this pandemic lasts for another year, we'll be on to level 2. Indeed, actually, if it lasts longer than 2 years, you could probably get a degree in theology by the end of this course. However, the prophecy came from Malachi, and this is what Malachi, or let's just say Isaiah, had written many, 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 many years before the birth of Jesus. God said, this is the prophet saying, many years before the birth of Jesus, God said, I will send my messenger ahead of you to clear the way for you. Someone is shouting in the desert, get the road ready for the Lord, make a straight path for him to travel. So, Mark is suggesting the messenger who is going to prepare the way for this man, Jesus, is John the Baptist. And the readers reading Mark's Gospel way back in the day would have known about this verse, get the road ready for the Lord, make a straight path for him to travel. Now, the equivalent of that, do you know our Queen? Do you know our Queen must smell fresh paint wherever she goes, because they're always decorating. Just before she arrives, something, oh, get the paintbrush out. Well, back in Palestine, during that first century, when the kings would ride out from their castles and fortresses on their chariots, think Ben-Hur, there would have been workmen who would have prepared the road. So they would have removed bumps in the road. They would have built bridges over ravines and rivers so that the kings in first century Palestine, because a chariot, I've never actually been in a chariot, but I'm guessing chariots are a bit bumpy, no suspension. So your bum would get sore after a wee while. So the smoother the path, the less sore it would be on your bum. So these engineers would have gone out to make the king's path as smooth as possible, so that when the king set out in his chariot, at the end of the journey, their bum wouldn't be so sore. I told you, it's going to be very basic. Do you know what I'm saying? So Mark is saying, nothing controversial about God, because people back then just believed in God. That was just it. That was just a fait accompli. There is a God. He's a bit controversial when he said, the Messiah, the Christ, is this guy Jesus. Oh, who is he? They were thinking, Jesus? What's he? Basically, what is happening during these first few verses is that Mark is saying there is someone who is preparing, making paths smooth, preparing the way of this Messiah who's mentioned in that first verse, Jesus. And the person who is preparing the way is this guy, John the Baptist. So people were really interested. Maybe that's why hundreds, thousands of them flocked out to the desert to hear this, if you like, wild man going on about things about to happen. So I'm going to stop there. Aren't you delighted that I've actually started these reflections? So I'm going to stop there, and we will continue reading the next few verses tomorrow. So keep safe and keep vigilant.